Chapter 25 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. The Slipperbox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 25. The Port of Missing Men. Fast they come, fast they come. See how they gather. Wide waves the eagle plume, blended with heather. Cast your plaids, draw your blades, forward each man set. Pibroch of Donegal Dhu, knell for the onset. Sir Walter Scott. Claiborne climbed upon a rock to get his bearings, and as he gazed off through the wood a bullet sang close to his head, and he saw a man slipping away through the underbrush 100 yards ahead of him. He threw up his rifle and fired after the retreating figure, jerked the lever spitefully, and waited. In a few minutes Oscar rode alertly out of the wood at his left. "It is better for us a dead horse than a dead man, yes?" was the little sergeant's comment. "We shall come back for the saddle and bridle." "Humph! Where do you think those men are?" "Behind some rocks near the edge of the gap. It is a poor position." "I'm not sure of that. They'll escape across the old bridge." "Nine. A sparrow would shake it down. 3 men at once. They would not need our bullets." Far away to the right 2 reports in quick succession gave news of Armitage. "It's the signal that he's got between them and the gate. Swing around to the left, and I will go straight to the big clearing and meet you." "You will have my horse, yes?" Oscar began to dismount. "No, I do well enough this way. Forward! The word is to keep them between us and the gap until we can sit on them." The mist was fast disappearing and swirling away under a sharp wind, and the sunlight broke warmly upon the drenched world. Claiborne started through the wet undergrowth at a dog trot. Armitage, he judged, was about half a mile away, and to make their line complete Oscar should traverse an equal distance. The soldier blood in Claiborne warmed at the prospect of a definite contest. He grinned as it had occurred to him that he had won the distinction of having a horse shot under him in an open road fight, almost within sight of the dome of the Capitol. The brush grew thinner and the trees fewer, and he dropped down and crawled presently to the shelter of a boulder, from which he could look out upon the open and fairly level field known as the Port of Missing Men. There as a boy he had dreamed of battles as he pondered the legend of the Lost Legion. At the far edge of the field was a fringe of stunted cedars, like an abatis, partially concealing the old barricade where, in the golden days of their youth, he had played with Shirley at storming the fort, and Shirley, in these fierce assaults, had usually tumbled over upon the imaginary enemy ahead of him. As he looked about he saw Armitage, his horse at a walk, ride slowly out of the wood at his right. Claiborne jumped up and waved his hat, and a rifle ball flicked his coat collar as lightly as though an unseen hand had tried to brush a bit of dust from it. As he turned toward the marksman behind the cedar 3 shots, fired in a volley, hummed about him. Then it was very still, with the Sabbath stillness of early morning in the hills, and he heard faintly the mechanical click and snap of the rifles of Chauvenet's party as they expelled their exploded cartridges and refilled their magazines. "They're not really so bad. Bad luck to them," he muttered. "I'll be right for the little brown men after I get through with this." And Claiborne laughed a little and watched Armitage's slow advance out into the open. The trio behind the barricade had not yet seen the man they had crossed the sea to kill, as the line of his approach closely paralleled the long irregular wall with its fringe of cedars, but they knew from Claiborne's signal that he was there. The men had picketed their horses back of the little fort, and Claiborne commended their good generalship and wondered what sort of beings they were to risk so much upon so wild an adventure. Armitage rode out farther into the opening, and Claiborne, with his eyes on the barricade, saw a man lean forward through the cedars in an effort to take aim at the horseman. Claiborne drew up his own rifle and blazed away. Bits of stone spurted into the air below the target's elbow, and the man dropped back out of sight without firing. "I've never been the same since that fever," growled Claiborne, and snapped out the shell spitefully, and watched for another chance. Being direct in front of the barricade, he was in a position to cover Armitage's advance, and Oscar, meanwhile, had taken his cue from Armitage and ridden slowly into the field from the left. The men behind the cedars fired now from within the enclosure at both men without exposing themselves, but their shots flew wild, and the two horsemen rode up to Claiborne, who had emptied his rifle into the cedars and was reloading. "They are all together again, are they?" asked Armitage, pausing a few yards from Claiborne's rock, his eyes upon the barricade. "The gentleman with the curly hair, I drove him in. He is a damned poor shot, yes?" Oscar tightened his belt and waited for orders, while Armitage and Claiborne conferred in quick pointed sentences. "Shall we risk a rush or starve them out? I'd like to try hunger on them," said Armitage. "They'll all sneak off over the bridge tonight if we pen them up. If they all go at once they'll break it down and we'll lose our quarry. But you want to capture them, alive?" "I certainly do," Armitage replied, and turned to laugh at Oscar, who had fired at the barricade from the back of his horse, which was resenting the indignity by trying to throw his rider. The enemy now concentrated a sharp fire upon Armitage, whose horse snorted and pawed the ground as the balls cut the air and earth. "For God's sake, get off that horse, Armitage!" bawled Claiborne, rising upon the rock. "There's no use in wasting yourself that way." "My arm aches, and I've got to do something. Let's try storming them just for fun. It's a cavalry stunt, Claiborne, and you can play being the artillery that's supporting our advance. Fall away there, Oscar, about 40 yards, and we'll race for it to the wall and over. The barricade isn't as stiff as it looks from this side. Know all about it. There are great chunks out of it that can't be seen from this side." "Thank me for that, Armitage. I tumbled down a good many yards of it when I played up here as a kid. Get off that horse, I tell you. You've got a hole in you now. Get down." "You make me tired, Claiborne. This beautiful row will all be over in a few minutes. I never intended to waste much time on those fellows when I got them where I wanted them." His left arm hung quite limp at his side and his face was very white. He had dropped his rifle in the road at the moment the ball struck his shoulder, but he still carried his revolver. He nodded to Oscar, and they both galloped forward over the open ground, making straight for the cedar covert. Claiborne was instantly up and away between the two riders. Their bold advance evidently surprised the trio beyond the barricade, who shouted hurried commands to one another as they distributed themselves along the wall and awaited the onslaught. Then they grew still and lay low out of sight as the silent riders approached. The hoofs of the onrushing horses rang now and then on the harsh outcropping rock, and here and there struck fire. Armitage sat erect and steady in his saddle, his horse speeding on in great bounds toward the barricade. His lips moved in a curious stiff fashion, as though he were ill, muttering, "For Austria, for Austria. He bade me do something for the Empire." Beyond the cedars the trio held their fire, watching with fascinated eyes the two riders, every instant drawing closer, and the runner who followed them. "They can't jump this. They'll veer off before they get here," shouted Chauvenet to his comrades. "Wait till they check their horses for the turn." "We are fools. They have got us trapped," and Durand's hands shook as he restlessly fingered a revolver. The big Servian crouched on his knees near by, his finger on the trigger of his rifle. All three were hatless and unkempt. The wound in Zmai's scalp had broken out afresh, and he had twisted a colored handkerchief about it to stay the bleeding. 100 yards away the waterfall splashed down the defile, and its faint murmur reached them. A wild dove rose ahead of Armitage and flew straight before him over the barricade. The silence grew tense as the horses galloped nearer. The men behind the cedar-lined wall heard only the hollow thump of hoofs and Claiborne's voice calling to Armitage and Oscar to warn them of his whereabouts. But the eyes of the three conspirators were fixed on Armitage. It was his life they sought. The others did not greatly matter. And so John Armitage rode across the little plain where the Lost Legion had camped for a year at the end of a great war. And as he rode on, the defenders of the boulder barricade saw his white face and noted the useless arm hanging and swaying, and felt, in spite of themselves, the strength of his tall, erect figure. Chauvenet, watching the silent rider, said aloud, speaking in German, so that Zmai understood, "It is in the blood. He is like a king." But they could not hear the words that John Armitage kept saying over and over again as he crossed the field. "He bade me do something for Austria. for Austria." "He is brave, but he is a great fool. When he turns his horse we will fire on him," said Zmai. Their eyes were upon Armitage, and in their intentness they failed to note the increasing pace of Oscar's horse, which was spurting slowly ahead. When they saw that he would first make the sweep which they assumed to be the contemplated strategy of the charging party, they levelled their arms at him, believing that he must soon check his horse. But on he rode, bending forward a little, his rifle held across the saddle in front of him. "Take him first," cried Chauvenet. "Then be ready for Armitage." Oscar was now turning his horse, but toward them and across Armitage's path, with the deliberate purpose of taking the first fire. Before him rose the cedars that concealed the line of wall, and he saw the blue barrels of the waiting rifles. With a great spurt of speed he cut ahead of Armitage swiftly and neatly, then on, without a break or a pause, not heeding Armitage's cries, on and still on, till 20, then 10 feet lay between him and the wall, at a place where the cedar barrier was thinnest. Then, as his horse crouched and rose, 3 rifles cracked as one. With a great crash the horse struck the wall and tumbled, rearing and plunging through the tough cedar boughs. An instant later, near the same spot Armitage, with better luck clearing the wall, was borne on through the confused line. When he flung himself down and ran back, Claiborne had not yet appeared. Oscar had crashed through at a point held by Durand, who was struck down by the horse's forefeet. He lay howling with pain, with the hindquarters of the prostrate beast across his legs. Armitage, running back toward the wall, kicked the revolver from his hand and left him. Zmai had started to run as Oscar gained the wall, and Chauvenet's curses did not halt the Servian when he found Oscar at his heels. Chauvenet stood impassively by the wall, his revolver raised and covering Armitage, who walked slowly and doggedly toward him. The pallor in Armitage's face gave him an unearthly look. He appeared to be trying to force himself to a pace of which his wavering limbs were incapable. At the moment that Claiborne sprang upon the wall behind Chauvenet, Armitage swerved and stumbled, then swayed from side to side like a drunken man. His left arm swung limp at his side, and his revolver remained undrawn in his belt. His gray felt hat was twitched to one side of his head, adding a grotesque touch to the impression of drunkenness, and he was talking aloud. "Shoot me, Monsieur Chauvenet. Go on and shoot me. I am John Armitage, and I live in Montana, where real people are. Go on and shoot. Winklereed's in jail, and the jig's up, and the Empire and the silly king are safe. Go on and shoot, I tell you." He had stumbled on until he was within a dozen steps of Chauvenet, who lifted his revolver until it covered Armitage's head. "Drop that gun. Drop it damned quick." And Dick Claiborne swung the butt of his rifle high and brought it down with a crash upon Chauvenet's head. Then Armitage paused and glanced about and laughed. It was Claiborne who freed Durand from the dead horse, which had received the shots fired at Oscar the moment he rose at the wall. The fight was quite knocked out of the conspirator, and he swore under his breath, cursing the unconscious Chauvenet and the missing Zmai and the ill fortune of the fight. "It's all over but the shouting. What's next?" demanded Claiborne. "Tie him up, and tie the other one up," said Armitage, staring about queerly. "Where the devil is Oscar?" "He's after the big fellow. You're badly fussed, old man. We've got to get you out of this and fix you up." "I'm all right. I've got a hole in my shoulder that feels as big and hot as a blast furnace. But you've got them nailed. And it's all right, old man." Durand continued to curse things visible and invisible as he rubbed his leg, while Claiborne watched him impatiently. "If you start to run, I'll certainly kill you, monsieur." "We have met, my dear sir, under rather unfortunate circumstances. You should not take it too much to heart about the potato sack. It was the fault of my dear colleagues. Ah, Armitage, you look rather ill, but I trust you will harbor no harsh feelings." Armitage did not look at him. His eyes were upon the prostrate figure of Chauvenet, who seemed to be regaining his wits. He moaned and opened his eyes. "Search him, Claiborne, to make sure. Then get him on his legs and pinion his arms, and tie the gentleman together. The bridle on that dead horse is quite the thing." "But, messieurs," began Durand, who was striving to recover his composure, "this is unnecessary. My friend and I are quite willing to give you every assurance of our peaceable intentions." "I don't question it," laughed Claiborne. "But, my dear sir, in America, even in delightful America, the law will protect the citizens of another country." "It will, indeed," and Claiborne grinned, put his revolver into Armitage's hand, and proceeded to cut the reins from the dead horse. "In America such amiable scoundrels as you are given the freedom of cities, and little children scatter flowers in their path. You ought to write for the funny papers, monsieur." "I trust your wounds are not serious, my dear Armitage." Armitage, sitting on a boulder, turned his eyes wearily upon Durand, whose wrists Claiborne was knotting together with a strap. The officer spun the man around viciously. "You beast! If you address Mr. Armitage again, I'll choke you." Chauvenet, sitting up and staring dully about, was greeted ironically by Durand. "Prisoners, my dearest Jules, prisoners, do you understand? Will you please arrange with dear Armitage to let us go home and be good?" Claiborne emptied the contents of Durand's pockets upon the ground and tossed a flask to Armitage. "We will discuss matters at the bungalow. They always go to the nearest farmhouse to sign the treaty of peace. Let us do everything according to the best traditions." A moment later Oscar ran in from the direction of the gap, to find the work done and the party ready to leave. "Where is the Servian?" demanded Armitage. The soldier saluted, glanced from Chauvenet to Durand, and from Claiborne to Armitage. "He will not come back," said the sergeant quietly. "That is bad," remarked Armitage. "Take my horse and ride down to Storm Springs, and tell Baron von Marhof and Judge Claiborne that Captain Claiborne has found John Armitage, and that he presents his compliments and wishes them to come to Mr. Armitage's house at once. Tell them that Captain Claiborne sent you, and that he wants them to come back with you immediately." "But Armitage, not Marhof! For God's sake, not Marhof!" Chauvenet staggered to his feet, and his voice choked as he muttered his appeal. "Not Marhof!" "We can fix this among ourselves. Just wait a little, till we can talk over our affairs. You have quite the wrong impression of us, I assure you, messieurs," protested Durand. "That is your misfortune. Thanks for the brandy, Monsieur Durand. I feel quite restored," said Armitage, rising, and the color swept into his face, and he spoke with quick decision. "Oh, Claiborne, will you kindly give me the time?" Claiborne laughed. It was a laugh of real relief at the change in Armitage's tone. "It's 7:15. This little scrap didn't take as much time as you thought it would." Oscar had mounted Armitage's horse, and Claiborne stopped him as he rode past on his way to the road. "After you deliver Mr. Armitage's message, get a doctor, and tell him to be in a hurry about getting here." "No," began Armitage. "Good Lord, no! We are not going to advertise this mess. You will spoil it all. I don't propose to be arrested and put in jail, and a doctor would blab it all. I tell you, no." "Oscar, go to the hotel at the Springs, and ask for Dr. Bledsoe. He's an army surgeon on leave. Tell him I want him to bring his tools and come to me at the bungalow. Now go." The conspirators' horses were brought up, and Claiborne put Armitage upon the best of them. "Don't treat me as though I were a sick priest. I tell you, I feel bully. If the prisoners will kindly walk ahead of us, we'll graciously ride behind. Or we might put them both on one horse. Forward." Chauvenet and Durand, as they marched ahead of their captors, divided the time between execrating each other and trying to make terms with Armitage. The thought of being haled before Baron von Marhof gave them great concern. "Wait a few hours, Armitage. Let us sit down and talk it all over. We are not as black as your imagination paints us." "Save your breath. You have had your fun so far, and now I'm going to have mine. You fellows are all right to sit in dark rooms and plot murder and treason, but you're not made for work in the open. Forward!" They were a worn company that drew up at the empty bungalow, where the lamp and candles flickered eerily. On the table still lay the sword, the cloak, the silver box, the insignia of noble orders. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 26. Who are you, John Armitage? Morbleu, monsieur, you give me too much majesty, said the prince. The History of Henry Esmond. These gentlemen doubtless wish to confer. Let them sequester themselves. And Armitage waved his hand to the line of empty sleeping rooms. I believe Monsieur Durand already knows the way about. He may wish to explore my trunks again. And Armitage bowed to the two men, who, with their wrists tied behind them and a strap linking them together, looked the least bit absurd. Now, Claiborne, that foolish Oscar has a first aid kit of some sort that he used on me a couple of weeks ago. Dig it out of his simple cell back there, and we'll clear up this mess in my shoulder. Twice on the same side, but I believe they actually cracked a bone this time. He lay down on a long bench, and Claiborne cut off his coat. I'd like to hold a little private execution for this, growled the officer. A little lower, and it would have caught you in the heart. Don't be spiteful. I'm as sound as wheat. We have them down, and the victory is ours. The great fun is to come when the good Baron von Marhof gets here. If I were dying, I believe I could hold on for that. You're not going to die, thank God. Just a minute more until I pack this shoulder with cotton. I can't do anything for that smashed bone, but Bledsoe is the best surgeon in the army, and he'll fix you up in a jiffy. That will do now. I must have a coat on when our honored guests arrive, even if we omit one sleeve. Yes, I guess we'll have to, though it does seem a bit affected. Dig out the brandy bottle from the cupboard there in the corner, and then kindly brush my hair and straighten up the chairs a bit. You might even toss a stick on the fire. That potato sack you may care to keep as a souvenir. Be quiet now. Remember, you are my prisoner, Mr. Armitage. I am. But I will wager 10 courses at Sherry's the Baron will be glad to let me off. He laughed softly and began repeating. Why, hear you, my masters, as if it was for me to kill the heir apparent. Should I turn upon the true prince? Why, thou knowest I am as valiant as Hercules. But beware instinct. The lion will not touch the true prince. Instinct is a great matter. I was a coward on instinct. I shall think the better of myself and thee during my life. I for a valiant lion, and thou for a true prince. Claiborne forced him to lie down on the bench and threw a blanket over him, and in a moment saw that he slept. In an inner room the voices of the prisoners occasionally rose shrilly as they debated their situation and prospects. Claiborne chewed a cigar, and watched and waited. Armitage wakened suddenly, sat up, and called to Claiborne with a laugh. I had a perfectly bully dream, old man. I dreamed that I saw the ensign of Austria-Hungary flying from the flagstaff of this shanty, and by Jove, I'll take the hint. We owe it to the distinguished ambassador who now approaches to fly his colors over the front door. We ought to have a trumpeter to herald his arrival, but the white and red ensign with the golden crown, it's in the leather-covered trunk in my room, the one with the most steamer labels on it. Go bring it, Claiborne, and we'll throw it to the free airs of Virginia. And be quick. They ought to be here by this time. He stood in the door and watched Claiborne haul up the flag, and he made a mockery of saluting it as it snapped out in the fresh morning air. The port of missing men. It was designed to be extraterritorial, and there's no treason in hauling up an alien flag. And his high spirits returned, and he stalked back to the fireplace, chaffing Claiborne and warning him against ever again fighting under an unknown banner. Here they are, called Claiborne, and flung open the door as Shirley, her father, and Baron von Marhof rode up under the billowing ensign. Dick stepped out to meet them and answer their questions. Mr. Armitage is here. He has been hurt, and we have sent for a doctor, but—" and he looked at Shirley. "If you will do me the honor to enter, all of you," and Armitage came out quickly and smiled upon them. "We had started off to look for Dick when we met your man," said Shirley, standing on the steps, rein in hand. "What has happened, and how was Armitage injured?" demanded Judge Claiborne. "There was a battle," replied Dick, grinning, "and Mr. Armitage got in the way of a bullet." Her ride through the keen morning air had flooded Shirley's cheeks with color. She wore a dark blue skirt, and a mackintosh with the collar turned up about her neck, and a red scarf at her throat matched the band of her soft felt hat. She drew off her gauntlets and felt in her pocket for a handkerchief, with which to brush some splashes of mud that had dried on her cheek, and the action was so feminine, and marked so abrupt a transition from the strange business of the night and morning, that Armitage and Dick laughed, and Judge Claiborne turned upon them frowningly. Shirley had been awake much of the night. On returning from the ball at the inn she found Dick still absent, and when at 6 o'clock he had not returned, she called her father, and they had set off together for the hills, toward which, the stableman reported, Dick had ridden. They had met Oscar just outside the Springs, and had returned to the hotel for Baron von Marhof. Having performed her office as guide and satisfied herself that Dick was safe, she felt her conscience eased, and could see no reason why she should not ride home and leave the men to their counsel. Armitage saw her turn to her horse, whose nose was exploring her mackintosh pockets, and stepped quickly toward her. "You see, Miss Claiborne, your brother is quite safe. But I very much hope you will not run away. There are some things to be explained, which it is only fair you should hear." "Wait, Shirley, and we'll all go down together," said Judge Claiborne reluctantly. Baron von Marhof, very handsome and distinguished, but mud-splashed, had tied his horse to a post in the driveway and stood on the veranda steps, his hat in his hand, staring, a look of bewilderment on his face. Armitage, bareheaded, still in his riding leggings, his trousers splashed with mud, his left arm sleeveless and supported by a handkerchief swung from his neck, shook hands with Judge Claiborne. "Baron von Marhof, allow me to present Mr. Armitage," said Dick, and Armitage walked to the steps and bowed. The ambassador did not offer his hand. "Won't you please come in?" said Armitage, smiling upon them, and when they were seated he took his stand by the fireplace, hesitated a moment as though weighing his words, and began. "Baron von Marhof, the events that have led to this meeting have been somewhat more than unusual. They are unique, and complications have arisen which require prompt and wise action. For this reason I am glad that we shall have the benefit of Judge Claiborne's advice." "Judge Claiborne is the counsel of our embassy," said the ambassador. His gaze was fixed intently on Armitage's face, and he hitched himself forward in his chair impatiently, grasping his crop nervously across his knees. "You were anxious to find me, Baron, and I may have seemed hard to catch, but I believe we have been working at cross purposes to serve the same interests." The Baron nodded. "Yes, I dare say," he remarked dryly. "And some other gentlemen, of not quite your own standing, have at the same time been seeking me. It will give me great pleasure to present one of them. One, I believe, will be enough. Mr. Claiborne, will you kindly allow Monsieur Jules Chauvenet to stand in the door for a moment? I want to ask him a question." Shirley, sitting farthest from Armitage, folded her hands upon the long table and looked toward the door into which her brother vanished. Then Jules Chauvenet stood before them all, and as his eyes met hers for a second the color rose to his face, and he broke out angrily. "This is infamous! It is an outrage! Baron von Marhof, as an Austrian subject, I appeal to you for protection from this man." "Monsieur, you shall have all the protection Baron von Marhof cares to give you. But first I wish to ask you a question. Just one. You followed me to America with the fixed purpose of killing me. You sent a Servian assassin after me, a fellow with a reputation for doing dirty work, and he tried to stick a knife into me on the deck of the King Edward. I shall not recite my subsequent experiences with him, or with you and Monsieur Durand. You announced at Captain Claiborne's table at the Army and Navy Club in Washington that I was an impostor. And all the time, monsieur, you have really believed me to be someone in particular." Armitage's eyes glittered, and his voice faltered with intensity as he uttered these last words. Then he thrust his hand into his coat pocket, stepped back, and concluded, "Who am I, monsieur?" Chauvenet shifted uneasily from one foot to another under the gaze of the 5 people who waited for his answer. Then he screamed shrilly, "You are the devil! An impostor! A liar! A thief!" Baron von Marhof leaped to his feet and roared at Chauvenet in English. "Who is this man? Whom do you believe him to be?" "Answer, and be quick about it," snapped Claiborne. "I tell you," began Chauvenet fiercely. Who am I? asked Armitage again. I don't know who you are. You do not. You certainly do not, laughed Armitage. But whom have you believed me to be, monsieur? I thought. Yes, you thought. I thought there seemed reason to believe. Yes, and you believe it. Go on. Chauvenet's eyes blinked for a moment as he considered the difficulties of his situation. The presence of Baron von Marhof sobered him. America might not, after all, be so safe a place from which to conduct an old-world conspiracy, and this incident must, if possible, be turned to his own account. He addressed the Baron in German. This man is a designing plotter. He is bent upon mischief and treason. He has contrived an attempt against the noble ruler of our nation. He is a menace to the throne. Who is he? Demanded Marhof impatiently, and his eyes and the eyes of all fell upon Armitage. I tell you, we found him lurking about in Europe, waiting for his chance, and we drove him away, drove him here to watch him. See these things, that sword, those orders. They belonged to the Archduke Karl. Look at them and see if it is true. I tell you we have rendered Austria a high service. One death at Vienna, and this son of a madman would be king. He is Frederick Augustus, the son of the Archduke Karl. The room was very still as the last words rang out. The old ambassador's gaze clung to Armitage. He stepped nearer, the perspiration breaking out upon his brow, and his lips trembled as he faltered. He would be king. He would be king. Then Armitage spoke sharply to Claiborne. That will do. The gentleman may retire now. As Claiborne thrust Chauvenet out of the room, Armitage turned to the little company, smiling. I am not Frederick Augustus, the son of the Archduke Karl, he said quietly, nor did I ever pretend that I was, except to lead those men on in their conspiracy. The cigarette case that caused so much trouble at Mr. Claiborne's supper party belongs to me. Here it is. The old ambassador snatched it from him eagerly. This device, the falcon poised upon a silver helmet. You have much to explain, monsieur. It is the coat of arms of the house of Schomberg. The case belonged to Frederick Augustus, Karl's son, and this sword was his, and these orders and that cloak lying yonder, all were his. They were gifts from his father, and believe me, my friends, I came by them honestly. The Baron bent over the table and spilled the orders from their silver box and scanned them eagerly. The colored ribbons, the glittering jewels, held the eyes of all. Many of them were the insignia of rare orders no longer conferred. There were the crown and pendant cross of the invincible knights of Zähringer, the white falcon upon a silver helmet, swung from a ribbon of cloth of gold, the familiar device of the house of Schomberg, the gold Maltese cross of the Chevaliers of the Blessed Sacrament, the crossed swords above an iron crown of the ancient Legion of St. Michael and all angels, and the full-rigged ship pendant from triple anchors, the decoration of the rare Spanish order of the Star of the Seven Seas. Silence held the company as the ambassador's fine old hands touched one after another. It seemed to Shirley that these baubles again bound the new world, the familiar hills of home, the Virginia shores, to the wallowing caravels of Columbus. The ambassador closed the silver box, the better to examine the white falcon upon its lid. Then he swung around and confronted Armitage. Where is he, monsieur? He asked, his voice sunk to a whisper, his eyes sweeping the doors and windows. The Archduke Karl is dead. His son, Frederick Augustus, whom these conspirators have imagined me to be, he, too, is dead. You are quite sure? You are quite sure, Mr. Armitage? I am quite sure. That is not enough. We have a right to ask more than your word. No, it is not enough, replied Armitage quietly. Let me make my story brief. I need not recite the peculiarities of the Archduke, his dislike of conventional society, his contempt for sham and pretense. After living a hermit life at one of the smallest and most obscure of the royal estates for several years, he vanished utterly. That was 15 years ago. Yes, he was mad, quite mad, blurted the Baron. That was the common impression. He took his oldest son and went into exile. Conjectures as to his whereabouts have filled the newspapers sporadically ever since. He has been reported as appearing in South Sea Islands, in India, in Australia, in various parts of this country. In truth, he came directly to America, and established himself as a farmer in western Canada. His son was killed in an accident. The Archduke died within the year." Judge Claiborne bent forward in his chair as Armitage paused. "What proof have you of this story, Mr. Armitage?" "I am prepared for such a question, gentlemen. His identity I may establish by various documents which he gave me for the purpose. For greater security I locked them in a safety box of the Bronx Loan and Trust Company in New York. To guard against accidents, I named you jointly with myself as entitled to the contents of that box. Here is the key." As he placed the slim bit of steel on the table and stepped back to his old position on the hearth, they saw how white he was and that his hand shook, and Dick begged him to sit down. "Yes, and will you not be seated, monsieur?" said the Baron kindly. "No, I shall have finished in a moment. The Archduke gave those documents to me, and with them a paper that will explain much in the life of that unhappy gentleman. It contains a disclosure that might in certain emergencies be of great value. I beg of you, believe that he was not a fool, and not a madman. He sought exile for reasons. For the reason that his son Francis, who has been plotting the murder of the new Emperor King, is not his son." "What?" roared the Baron. "It is as I have said. The faithlessness of his wife, and not madness, drove him into exile. He entrusted that paper to me, and swore me to carry it to Vienna if Francis ever got too near the throne. It is certified by half a dozen officials authorized to administer oaths in Canada, though they, of course, never knew the contents of the paper to which they swore him. He even carried it to New York, and swore it there before the Consul General of Austria-Hungary in that city. There was a certain grim humor in him. He said he wished to have the affidavit bear the seal of his own country, and the Consul General assumed that it was a document of mere commercial significance." The Baron looked at the key. He touched the silver box. His hand rested for a moment on the sword. "It is a marvelous story. It is wonderful. Can it be true? Can it be true?" murmured the ambassador. "The documents will be the best evidence. We can settle the matter in 24 hours," said Judge Claiborne. "You will pardon me for seeming incredulous, sir," said the Baron, "but it is all so extraordinary. And these men, these prisoners—" "They have pursued me under the impression that I am Frederick Augustus. Oddly enough, I, too, am Frederick Augustus," said Armitage, smiling. "I was within a few months of his age, and I had a little brush with Chauvenet and Durand in Geneva in which they captured my cigarette case. It had belonged to Frederick, and the Archduke gave it to me, and my troubles began. The Emperor King was old and ill. The disorders in Hungary were to cloak the assassination of his successor. Then the Archduke Francis, Karl's reputed son, was to be installed upon the throne." "Yes, there has been a conspiracy. "And there have been conspirators. 2 of them are safely behind that door, and somewhat through my efforts, their chief, Winkelried, should now be under arrest in Vienna. I have had reasons, beside my pledge to Archduke Karl, for taking an active part in these affairs. A year ago I gave Karl's repudiation of his second son to Count Ferdinand von Stroebel, the Prime Minister. The statement was stolen from him for the Winkelried conspirators by these men we now have locked up in this house." The ambassador's eyes blazed with excitement as these statements fell one by one from Armitage's lips. But Armitage went on. "I trust that my plan for handling these men will meet with your approval. They have chartered the George W. Custis, a fruit-carrying steamer lying at Morgan's Wharf in Baltimore, in which they expected to make off after they had finished with me. At one time they had some idea of kidnapping me, and it isn't my fault they failed at that game. But I leave it to you, gentlemen, to deal with them. I will suggest, however, that the presence just now in the West Indies of the cruiser Sophia Margaret, flying the flag of Austria-Hungary, may be suggestive." He smiled at the quick glance that passed between the ambassador and Judge Claiborne. Then Baron von Marhof blurted out the question that was uppermost in the minds of all. "Who are you, John Armitage?" And Armitage answered, quite simply, and in the quiet tone that he had used throughout. "I am Frederick Augustus von Stroebel, the son of your sister and the Count Ferdinand von Stroebel. The Archduke's son and I were schoolfellows and playmates. You remember as well as I my father's place near the royal lands. The Archduke talked much of democracy and the New World, and used to joke about the divine rights of kings. Let me make my story short. I found out their plan of flight and slipped away with them. It was believed that I had been carried away by gypsies." "Yes, that is true. It is all true. And you never saw your father? You never went to him?" "I was only 13 when I ran away with Karl. When I appeared before my father in Paris last year, he would have sent me away in anger, if it had not been that I knew matters of importance to Austria. Austria, always Austria." "Yes, that was quite like him," said the ambassador. "He served his country with a passionate devotion. He hated America. He distrusted the whole democratic idea. It was that which pointed his anger against you, that you should have chosen to live here." "Then when I saw him at Geneva, that last interview, he told me that Karl's statement had been stolen, and he had his spies abroad looking for the thieves. He was very bitter against me. It was only a few hours before he was killed, as a part of the Winkelried conspiracy. He had given his life for Austria. He told me never to see him again, never to claim my own name until I had done something for Austria. And I went to Vienna and knelt in the crowd at his funeral, and no one knew me, and it hurt me. Oh, it hurt me to know that he had grieved for me, that he had wanted a son to carry on his own work, while I had grown away from the whole idea of such labor as his. And now—" He faltered, his hoarse voice broke with stress of feeling, and his pallor deepened. "It was not my fault. It was really not my fault. I did the best I could, and, by God, I've gotten them in the room there where they can't do any harm. And Dick Claiborne, you are the finest fellow in the world, and the squarest and bravest. And I want to take your hand before I go to sleep. For I'm sick. Yes, I'm sick and sleepy. And you'd better haul down that flag over the door. It's treason, I tell you. And if you see Shirley, tell her I'm John Armitage. Tell her I'm John Armitage. The room and its figures rushed before his eyes, and as he tried to stand erect his knees crumpled under him, and before they could reach him he sank to the floor with a moan. As they crowded about he stirred slightly, sighed deeply, and lay perfectly still. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 27. Decent Burial. Tomorrow. 'Tis not ours to know that we shall again see the flowers. Tomorrow is the gods', but oh, today is ours. C. E. Merrill, Jr. Claiborne called Oscar through the soft dusk of the April evening. The phalanx of stars marched augustly across the heavens. Claiborne lifted his face gratefully to the cool night breeze, for he was worn with the stress and anxiety of the day, and there remained much to do. The bungalow had been speedily transformed into a hospital. One nurse, borrowed from a convalescent patient in the Springs, was to be reinforced by another summoned by wire from Washington. The ambassador's demand to be allowed to remove Armitage to his own house at the Springs had been promptly rejected by the surgeon. A fever had hold of John Armitage, who was ill enough without the wound in his shoulder, and the surgeon moved his traps to the bungalow and took charge of the case. Oscar had brought Claiborne's bag, and all was now in readiness for the night. Oscar's erect figure at salute and his respectful voice brought Claiborne down from the stars. "We can get rid of the prisoners tonight, yes?" "At midnight 2 Secret Service men will be here from Washington to travel with them to Baltimore to their boat. The Baron and my father arranged it over the telephone from the Springs. The prisoners understand that they are in serious trouble, and have agreed to go quietly. The government agents are discreet men. You brought up the buckboard." "But the men should be hanged." for they shoot our captain, and he may die." The little man spoke with sad cadence. The pathos in his erect, sturdy figure, his lowered tone as he referred to Armitage, touched Claiborne. "He will get well, Oscar. Everything will seem brighter tomorrow. You had better sleep until it is time to drive to the train." Oscar stepped nearer, and his voice sank to a whisper. "I have not forgotten the tall man who died. It is not well for him to go unburied. You are not a Catholic, no?" "You need not tell me how, or anything about it. But are you quite sure he is dead?" "He is dead. He was a bad man, and died very terribly," said Oscar, and he took off his hat and drew his sleeve across his forehead. "I will tell you just how it was. When my horse took the wall and got their bullets and tumbled down dead, the big man they call Zmai saw how it was, that we were all coming over after them, and ran. He kept running through the brambles and over the stones, and I thought he would soon turn and we might have a fight, but he did not stop. And I could not let him get away. It was our captain who said, 'We must take them prisoners.' Was it not so?" "Yes, that was Mr. Armitage's wish." "Then I saw that we were going toward the bridge, the one they do not use, there at the deep ravine. I had crossed it once, and knew that it was weak and shaky, and I slacked up and watched him. He kept on, and just before he came to it, when I was very close to him, for he was a slow runner, yes, being so big and clumsy, he turned and shot at me with his revolver. But he was in a hurry and missed, but he ran on. His feet struck the planks of the bridge, with a great jar and creaking, but he kept running and stumbling, and fell once with a mad clatter of the planks. He was a coward, with a heart of water, and would not stop when I called, and come back for a little fight. The wires of the bridge hummed, and the bridge swung and creaked. When he was almost midway of the bridge, the big wires that held it began to shriek out of the old posts that held them, though I had not touched them, and it seemed many years that had passed, while the whole of it dangled in the air like a bird nest in a storm, and the creek down below laughed at that big coward. I still heard his hoofs thumping the planks, until the bridge dropped from under him, and left him for a long second, with his arms and legs flying in the air. Yes, it was very horrible to see, and then his great body went down, down. God, it was a very dreadful way for a wicked man to die." And Oscar brushed his hat with his sleeve and looked away at the purple and grey ridges and their burden of stars. "Yes, it must have been terrible," said Claiborne. "But now he cannot be left to lie down there on the rocks, though he was so wicked and died like a beast. I am a bad Catholic, but when I was a boy I used to serve mass, and it is not well for a man to lie in a wild place where the buzzards will find him." "But you cannot bring a priest. Great harm would be done if news of this affair were to get abroad. You understand that what has passed here must never be known by the outside world. My father and Baron von Marhof have counseled that, and you may be sure that there are reasons why these things must be kept quiet, or they would seek the law's aid at once." "Yes, I have been a soldier, but after this little war I shall bury the dead. In an hour I shall be back to drive the buckboard to Lamar station." Claiborne looked at his watch. "I will go with you," he said. They started through the wood toward the port of missing men, and together they found rough niches in the side of the gap, down which they made their way toilsomely to the boulder-lined stream that laughed and tumbled foamily at the bottom of the defile. They found the wreckage of the slender bridge, broken to fragments where the planking had struck the rocks. It was very quiet in the mountain cleft, and the stars seemed withdrawn to newer and deeper arches of heaven as they sought in the debris for the Servian. They kindled a fire of twigs to give light for their search, and soon found the great body lying quite at the edge of the torrent, with arms flung out as though to ward off a blow. The face twisted with terror and the small evil eyes, glassed in death, were not good to see. "He was a wicked man, and died in sin. I will dig a grave for him by these bushes." When the work was done, Oscar took off his hat and knelt down by the side of the strange grave, and bowed his head in silence for a moment. Then he began to repeat words and phrases of prayers he had known as a peasant boy in a forest over the seas, and his voice rose to a kind of chant. Such petitions of the litany of the saints as he could recall he uttered, his voice rising mournfully among the rocks. From all evil, from all sin, from thy wrath, from sudden and unprovided death, O Lord, deliver us. Then he was silent, though in the wavering flame of the fire Claiborne saw that his lips still muttered prayers for the Servian soul. When again his words grew audible, he was saying, "That thou wouldst not deliver it into the hands of the enemy, nor forget it unto the earth, but wouldst command it to be received by the holy angels, and conducted to paradise, its true country, that, as in thee it hath hoped and believed, it may not suffer the pains of hell, but may take possession of eternal joys." He made the sign of the cross, rose, brushed the dirt from his knees, and put on his hat. "He is a coward, and died an ugly death, but I am glad I did not kill him." "Yes, we were spared murder," said Claiborne, and when they had trodden out the fire and scattered the embers into the stream, they climbed the steep side of the gap and turned toward the bungalow. Oscar trudged silently at Claiborne's side, and neither spoke. Both were worn to the point of exhaustion by the events of the long day. The stubborn patience and fidelity of the little man touched a chord in Claiborne. Almost unconsciously, he threw his arm across Oscar's shoulders and walked thus beside him as they traversed the battlefield of the morning. "You knew Mr. Armitage when he was a boy?" asked Claiborne. "Yes, in the Austrian forest, on his father's place, the Count Ferdinand von Stroebel. The young captain's mother died when he was a child. His father was the great statesman, and did much for the Schombergs and Austria, but it did not aid his disposition, no?" The Secret Service men had come by way of the Springs and were waiting at the bungalow to report to Claiborne. They handed him a sealed packet of instructions from the Secretary of War. The deportation of Chauvenet and Durand was to be effected at once under Claiborne's direction, and he sent Oscar to the stables at once for the buckboard, and sat down on the veranda to discuss the trip to Baltimore with the two secret agents. They were to gather up the personal effects of the conspirators at the tavern on the drive to Lamar. The rooms occupied by Chauvenet at Washington had already been ransacked, and correspondence and memoranda of a startling character seized. Chauvenet was known to be a professional blackmailer and plotter of political mischief, and the embassy of Austria-Hungary had identified Durand as an ex-convict who had only lately been implicated in the launching of a dangerous issue of forged bonds in Paris. Claiborne had been carefully coached by his father, and he answered the questions of the officers readily. "If these men give you any trouble, put them under arrest in the nearest jail. We can bring them back here for attempted murder, if nothing worse, and these mountain juries will see that they're put away for a long time. You will accompany them on board the George W. Custis, and stay with them until you reach Cape Charles. A lighthouse tender will follow the steamer down Chesapeake Bay and take you off. If these gentlemen do not give the proper orders to the captain of the steamer, you will put them all under arrest and signal the tender." Chauvenet and Durand had been brought out and placed in the buckboard, and these orders were intended for their ears. "We will waive our right to a writ of habeas corpus," remarked Durand cheerfully, as Claiborne flashed a lantern over them. "Dearest Jules, we shall not forget Monsieur Claiborne's courteous treatment of us." "Shut up!" snapped Chauvenet. "You will both do well to hold your tongues," remarked Claiborne dryly. "One of these officers understands French, and I assure you they cannot be bought or frightened. If you try to bolt, they will certainly shoot you. If you make a row about going on board your boat at Baltimore, remember they are government agents, with ample authority for any emergency, and that Baron von Marhof has the American State Department at his back." "You are wonderful, Captain Claiborne," drawled Durand. "There is no trap in this. You give us the freedom of the sea," demanded Chauvenet. "I give you the option of a Virginia prison for conspiracy to murder, or a run for your life in your own boat beyond the Capes. You have chosen the second alternative. If you care to change your decision—" Oscar gathered up the reins and waited for the word. Claiborne held his watch to the lantern. We must not miss our train, my dear Jules," said Durand. "Ah, Claiborne, this is ungenerous of you. You know well enough this is an unlawful proceeding, kidnapping us this way, without opportunity for counsel." "And without benefit of clergy," laughed Claiborne. "Is it a dash for the sea or the nearest county jail? If you want to tackle the American courts, we have nothing to venture. The Winkelried crowd are safe behind bars in Vienna, and publicity can do us no harm." "Drive on!" ejaculated Chauvenet. As the buckboard started, Baron von Marhof and Judge Claiborne rode up and watched the departure from their saddles. "That's the end of one chapter," remarked Judge Claiborne. "They're glad enough to go," said Dick. "What's the latest word from Vienna?" "The conspirators were taken quietly. About 100 arrests have been made in all, and the Hungarian uprising has played out entirely, thanks to Mr. John Armitage." And the Baron sighed and turned toward the bungalow. When the two diplomats rode home half an hour later, it was with the assurance that Armitage's condition was satisfactory. "He is a hardy plant," said the surgeon, "and will pull through." Chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 28. John Armitage. If so be you can discover a mode of life more desirable than the being a king, for those who shall be kings, then the true ideal of the state will become a possibility, but not otherwise. Marius the Epicurean. June roses overflowed the veranda rail of Baron von Marhof's cottage at Storm Springs. The ambassador and his friend and counsel, Judge Hilton Claiborne, sat in a cool corner with a wicker table between them. The representative of Austria-Hungary shook his glass with an impatience that tinkled the ice cheerily. "He's as obstinate as a mule." Judge Claiborne laughed at the Baron's vehemence. "He comes by it honestly. I can imagine his father doing the same thing under similar circumstances." "What! This rot about democracy! This light tossing away of an honest title, a respectable fortune! My dear sir, there is such a thing as carrying democracy too far." "I suppose there is, but he's of age. He's a grown man. I don't see what you're going to do about it." "Neither do I. But think what he's putting aside. The boy's clever. He has courage and brains, as we know. He could have position. The home government is under immense obligations to him. A word from me to Vienna, and his services to the crown would be acknowledged in the most generous fashion. And with his father's memory and reputation behind him—" "But the idea of reward doesn't appeal to him. We canvassed that last night." "There's one thing I haven't dared to ask him. To take his own name. To become Frederick Augustus von Stroebel, even if he doesn't want his father's money or the title. Quite likely he will refuse that, too." "It is possible. Most things seem possible with Armitage." "It's simply providential that he hasn't become a citizen of your republic. That would have been the last straw." They rose as Armitage called to them from a French window near by. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. When two diplomats get their heads together on a summer afternoon, the universe is in danger." He came toward them hatless, but trailing a stick that had been the prop of his later convalescence. His blue serge coat, a negligee shirt, and duck trousers had been drawn a few days before from the trunks brought by Oscar from the bungalow. He was clean shaven for the first time since his illness, and the two men looked at him with a new interest. His deepened temples and lean cheeks and hands told their story, but his step was regaining its old assurance, and his eyes were clear and bright. He thrust the little stick under his arm and stood erect, gazing at the near gardens and then at the hills. The wind tumbled his brown newly trimmed hair and caught the loose ends of his scarf and whipped them free. "Sit down. We were just talking of you. You are getting so much stronger every day that we can't be sure of you long," said the Baron. "You have spoiled me. I am not at all anxious to venture back into the world. These Virginia gardens are a dream world, where nothing is really quite true." "Something must be done about your father's estate soon. It's yours, waiting and ready." The Baron bent toward the young man anxiously. Armitage shook his head slowly, clasped the stick with both hands, and held it across his knees. "No, no, please let us not talk of that any more. I could not feel comfortable about it. I have kept my pledge to do something for his country, something that we may hope pleases him if he knows." The three were silent for a moment. A breeze, sweet with pine scent of the hills, swept the valley, taking tribute of the gardens as it passed. The Baron was afraid to venture his last request. "But the name, the honored name of the great statesman Austria has known, a name that will endure with the greatest names of Europe. Surely you can at least accept that." The ambassador's tone was gravely importunate, as though he were begging the cession of a city from a harsh conqueror. Armitage rose and walked the length of the veranda. He had not seen Shirley since that morning when the earth had slipped from under his feet at the bungalow. The Claibornes had been back and forth often between Washington and Storm Springs. The judge had just been appointed a member of the Brazilian Boundary Commission, which was to meet shortly in Berlin, and Mrs. Claiborne and Shirley were to go with him. In the Claiborne garden, beyond and below, he saw a flash of white here and there among the dark green hedges. He paused, leaned against a pillar, and waited until Shirley crossed one of the walks and passed slowly on, intent upon the rose trees. And he saw, or thought he saw, the sun searching out the gold in her brown hair. She was hatless. Her white gown emphasized the straight line of her figure. She paused to ponder some new arrangement of a line of hydrangeas, and he caught a glimpse of her against a pillar of crimson ramblers. Then he went back to the Baron. "How much of our row in the hills got into the newspapers?" he asked, sitting down. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The presence of the Sophia Margaret off the Capes caused inquiries to be made at the embassy, and several correspondents came down here to interview me. Then the revenue officers made some raids in the hills opportunely and created a local diversion. You were hurt while cleaning your gun. Please do not forget that. And you are a friend of my family, a very eccentric character who has chosen to live in the wilderness." The judge and Armitage laughed at these explanations, though there was a little constraint upon them all. The Baron's question was still unanswered. "You ceased to be of particular interest some time ago. While you were sick the fraudulent Von Kissel was arrested in Australia, and I believe some of the newspapers apologized to you handsomely." "That was very generous of them," and Armitage shifted his position slightly. A white skirt had flashed again in the Claiborne garden, and he was trying to follow it. At the same time there were questions he wished to ask and have answered. The Baroness von Marhof had already gone to Newport. The Baron lingered merely out of good feeling toward Armitage, for it was as Armitage that he was still known to the people of Storm Springs, to the doctor and nurses who tended him. "The news from Vienna seems tranquil enough," remarked Armitage. He had not yet answered the Baron's question, and the old gentleman grew restless at the delay. "I read in the Neue Freie Presse a while ago that Charles Louis is showing an unexpected capacity for affairs. It is reported, too, that an heir is in prospect. The Winkelried conspiracy is only a bad dream, and we may safely turn to other affairs." "Yes, but the margin by which we escaped is too narrow to contemplate." "We have been saying that a miss is as good as a mile," remarked Judge Claiborne. "We have never told Mr. Armitage that we found the papers in the safety box at New York to be as he described them." "They are dangerous. We have hesitated as to whether there is more risk in destroying them than in preserving them," said the Baron. Armitage shrugged his shoulders and laughed. "They are out of my hands. I positively decline to accept their further custody." A messenger appeared with a telegram, which the Baron opened and read. "It is from the commander of the Sophia Margaret, who is just leaving Rio de Janeiro for Trieste, and reports his prisoners safe and in good health." It was a happy thought to have him continue his cruise to the Brazilian coast before returning homeward. By the time he delivers those two scoundrels to his government, their fellow conspirators will have forgotten they ever lived. But, and Judge Claiborne shrugged his shoulders and smiled disingenuously, "as a lawyer, I deplore such methods. Think what a stir would be made in this country if it were known that two men had been kidnapped in the sovereign state of Virginia and taken out to sea under convoy of ships carrying our flag for transfer to an Austrian battleship. That's what we get for being a free republic that cannot countenance the extradition of a foreign citizen for political offense." Armitage was not listening. Questions of international law and comity had no interest for him whatever. The valley breeze, the glory of the blue Virginia sky, the far-stretching lines of hills that caught and led the eye like sea billows, the dark green of shrubbery, the slope of upland meadows, and that elusive, vanishing gleam of white, before such things as these, the splendor of empire and the might of armies were unworthy of man's desire. The Baron's next words broke harshly upon his mood. "The gratitude of kings is not a thing to be despised. You could go to Vienna and begin where most men leave off. Strong hands are needed in Austria. You could make yourself the younger, the great Stroebel." The mention of his name brought back the Baron's still unanswered question. He referred to it now, as he stood before them smiling. "I have answered all your questions but one. I shall answer that a little later. If you will excuse me for just a few minutes, I will go and get the answer. That is, gentlemen, I hope I shall be able to bring it back with me." He turned and ran down the steps and strode away through the long shadows of the garden. They heard the gate click after him as he passed into the Claiborne grounds, and then they glanced at each other with such a glance as may pass between two members of a peace commission sitting on the same side of the table, who will not admit to each other that the latest proposition of the enemy has been in the nature of a surprise. They did not, however, suffer themselves to watch Armitage, but diplomatically refilled their glasses. Through the green walls went Armitage. He had not been out of the Baron's grounds before since he was carried thence from the bungalow, and it was pleasant to be free once more, and able to stir without a nurse at his heels. And he swung along with his head and shoulders erect, walking with the confident stride of a man who has no doubt whatever of his immediate aim. At the pergola he paused to reconnoiter, finding on the bench certain vestigia that interested him deeply, a pink parasol, a contrivance of straw, lace, and pink roses that seemed to be a hat, and a June magazine. He jumped upon the bench where once he had sat, an exile, a refugee, a person discussed in disagreeable terms by the newspapers, and studied the landscape. Then he went up the gradual slope of the meadow until he came to the pasture wall. It was under the trees beneath which Oscar had waited for Zmai that he found her. "They told me you wouldn't dare venture out for a week," she said, advancing toward him and giving him her hand. "That was what they told me," he said laughingly, "but I escaped from my keepers." "You will undoubtedly take cold, without your hat." "Yes, I shall undoubtedly have pneumonia from exposure to the Virginia sunshine. I take my chances." "You may sit on the wall for 3 minutes. Then you must go back. I cannot be responsible for the life of a wounded hero." "Please," he held up his hand. "That's what I came to talk to you about." "About being a hero? You have taken an unfair advantage. I was going to send for the latest designs in laurel wreaths tomorrow." She sat down beside him on the wall. The sheep were a grayish blur against the green. A little negro boy was shepherding them, and they scampered before him toward the farther end of the pasture. The faint and vanishing tinkle of a bell, and the boy's whistle, gave emphasis to the country quiet of the late afternoon. They spoke rapidly and impersonally of his adventures in the hills and of his illness. When they looked at each other it was with swift, laughing glances. Her cheeks and hands were already brown, an honest brown won from May and June in the open field, not that blistered, peeling scarlet that marks the insincere devotee of racket, driver, and oar, who jumps into the game in August, but the real brown conferred by the dear mother of us all upon the faithful who go forth to meet her in April. Her hands interested him particularly. They were long, slender, and supple, and she had a pretty way of folding them upon her knees that charmed him. "I didn't know, Miss Claiborne, that I was going to lose my mind that morning at the bungalow, or I should have asked your brother to conduct you to the conservatory while I fainted. From what they told me, I must have been a little light-headed for a day or two. If I had been in my right mind, I shouldn't have let Captain Dick get mixed up in my business, and run the risk of getting killed in a nasty little row. Dear old Dick! I made a mess of that whole business. I ought to have telegraphed for the Storm Springs constable in the beginning, and told him that if he wasn't careful the noble house of Schomburg would totter and fall." "Yes, And just imagine the effect on our constable of telling him that the fate of an empire lay in his hands. It's hard enough to get a man arrested who beats his horse. But you must go back to your keepers. You haven't your hat. Neither have you. You shan't outdo me in recklessness. I inspected your hat as I came through the pergola. I liked it immensely. I came near seizing it as a spoil of war. The loot of the pergola. There would be cause for another war. I've rarely liked any hat so much. But the Baron will be after you in a moment. I can't be responsible for you. The Baron annoys me. He has given me a lot of worry, and that's what I've come to ask you about. Then I should say that you oughtn't to quarrel with a dear old man like Baron von Marhof. Besides, he's your uncle. No, no. I don't want him to be my uncle. I don't need any uncle. He glanced about with an anxiety that made her laugh. I understand perfectly. My father told me that the events of April in these hills were not to be mentioned. But don't worry. The sheep won't tell, and I won't. He was silent for a moment, as he thought out the words of what he wished to say to her. The sun was dipping down into the hills. The mellow air was still. The voice of a negro singing as he crossed a distant field stole sweetly upon them. Shirley. He touched her hand. Shirley, and his fingers closed upon hers. I love you, Shirley. From those days when I saw you in Paris, before the great Gettysburg battle picture, I loved you. You had felt the cry of the old world, the story that is in its battlefields, its beauty and romance, just as I had felt the call of this new and more wonderful world. I understood. I knew what was in your heart. I knew what those things meant to you, but I had to put them aside. I had chosen another life for myself, and the poor life that you saved, that is yours if you will take it. I have told your father and Baron von Marhof that I would not take the fortune my father left me. I would not go back there to be thanked or to get a ribbon to wear on my coat. But my name, the name I bore as a boy and disgraced in my father's eyes, his name that he made famous throughout the world, the name I cast aside with my youth, the name I flung away in anger, they wish me to take that. She withdrew her hand and rose and looked away toward the western hills. The greatest romance in the world is here, Shirley. I have dreamed it all over, in the Canadian woods, on the Montana ranch as I watched the herd at night. My father spent his life keeping a king on his throne, but I believe there are higher things and finer things than steadying a shaking throne or being a king. And the name that has meant nothing to me except dominion and power, it can serve no purpose for me to take it now. I have learned much from the poor Archduke. He taught me to hate the sham and shame of life that he had fled from. My father was the last great defender of the divine right of kings, but I believe in the divine right of men. And the dome of the Capitol in Washington does not mean to me force or hatred or power, but faith and hope and man's right to live and do and be whatever he can make himself. I will not go back or take the old name unless you tell me I must, Shirley. There was an instant in which they both faced the westering sun. He looked down suddenly, and the deep feeling in his heart went to his lips. It was that way. You were just like that when I first saw you, Shirley, with the dreams in your eyes. He caught her hand and kissed it, bending very low indeed. Suddenly, as he stood erect, her arms were about his neck, and her cheek with its warmth and color lay against his face. I do not know, and he scarcely heard the whispered words, I do not know Frederick Augustus von Stroebel, but I love John Armitage, she said. Then back across the meadow, through the rose-aisled ways of the quiet garden, they went hand in hand together, and answered the Baron's question. End of chapter 28, and end of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. Read by MaryAnn Spiegel in Elmhurst, Illinois, August 2011.